Welcome to Ecological Engineering Principles. So, when we talk about ecological engineering, we're talking about a variety of technologies that can be used to help improve the environment. So, this may be a treatment wetland. This one's actually attached to a wastewater treatment plant, and they're doing the final polishing, the tertiary treatment through a wastewater treatment plant. Could be, again, more wetlands, acid mine drainage. Here we have a series of wetlands that take the low pH water from acid mine drainage and actually clean up that water and remove and absorb some of the metals to make it better for releasing into the environment. Or again, here's another treatment. It's called a living machine. We basically grow plants and treat water through plant uptake and growth in a aquatic environment. Or you can do a rain garden. So you might have seen these in your neighborhoods coming up more and more, where basically you allow the runoff from a parking lot or from other areas to come to a rain garden and then infiltrate in the rain garden. So it actually not only treats the water, but also reduces storm surge. Or you might have seen a green wall. Here's a beautiful green wall. Or a green roof, where again, we're trying to infiltrate the water to reduce storm surge so that we can actually absorb some of that water and use it for plant growth. So, what is ecological design or ecological engineering? It's any form of design that minimizes environmentally destructive impacts by integrating itself with living processes. So, that's by Vander Ryan. Another definition by H.T. Odom, who's considered kind of the father of ecological engineering, is the design of sustainable systems consistent with ecological principles that integrate human activities into natural environments to the benefit of both. So, again, the idea is it benefits both the environment and human society, with ecology as the fundamental paradigm. It emphasizes diversity, resiliency, and adaptation to maintain a sustainable ecosystem. And it takes advantage of our understanding of the robust nature of ecological systems and uses that idea of understanding ecological systems to design new systems. So you can do restorations of systems. So you might see a system where it's been substantially disturbed by human activity, and then we actually restore that system using ecological design principles. Here's another example and a stream restoration. Or it can be developing all new systems. So here is the High Line, which was an old railroad line through the center of New York. And basically, they created an ecosystem. Actually, it was actually starting to create itself when they shut down the High Line and wildflowers were starting to grow. And then here they actually created it into an outdoor park and that's pleasing to people for they can connect with nature and actually created ecosystems and habitat. So again, we talked about ecology being the fundamental paradigm. So what is ecology? Again, it's the study of living things to one another and to the environment. So the fundamental unit of ecology is the ecosystem. So it's the network of the biotic and the abiotic components found in a particular location that function together as a whole through primary production, community respiration, and biogeochemical cycling. So our biota is going to be our organisms, where again, we have producers, we have primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers. We have, waste coming down, sediments, decomposers, and that system goes on. And then it's also the abiotic components. So the sunlight, the temperature, the rainfall, the climate, the soil conditions that affect the ecosystem. Ecosystems can be really complex. I love this graphic here because at the bottom it says it's a simplified food web of the Northwest Atlantic. So this is the simplified version. But you can see that within an ecosystem, there's many complexities where, again, for example, the cod here are related to the lumpfish, which are related to the jellyfish, which again, you have detritus and algae, which are related to the sea anemone and the cucumbers. And then you have birds up here that are also part of this ecosystem. So they're interdependent, meaning they depend on every other living and non-living element of the system. And they're really kind of the most complex things we have in the universe, the ecosystems. And the degree of complexity is often described in terms of, species richness or abundance. So self-design is this process where the species composition and the relative abundance, the distributions, and the network connections develop over time. So the idea is if I'm going to create a new ecosystem, or I'm going to restore an ecosystem, I might actually seed and have the initial choice of species that I put down, but really the strongest pathway, the ones that are going to take over and the ecosystem that's going to develop over time is where those strongest pathways prevail. And it's based on the energetic contributions of the organisms to the overall energetics of the system. So the successful species, the ones that are going to take off and really contribute to that species richness, are those that establish feedback pathways that reinforce processes contributing to the overall energy flow within the system. So during self-design, their base systems are basically ecosystems as they develop, as they're restored, as we form them, they're guided by this maximum power principle. And what that means, what that is self-design tend to develop network connections that use energy and feedback actions to aid the process of getting more resource or using them more efficiently. So the species that are able to provide the maximum power are the ones that are prevail, and the ecosystem is always trying to get towards that maximum power. So the species that kind of contribute to that, you need species at each level so that all the energy and the feedback is utilized in a maximum efficiency or a maximum power. And so when we think about building an ecosystem, we need to think about all of the different parts of it: the photosynthetic plants, the herbivores, the detritivores, the secondary carnivores, the primary carnivores. And again, in all of these, we have respiration that takes place. So we have energy that's no longer available to the system. So again, energy flow during consumption is not perfectly efficient, the second law of thermodynamics. But the total amount of energy does not change, but the amount of energy available to do work after the energy transfer is always less than the original amount of energy. So the trophic efficiency at any level in the food web is always less than 100%. And only about 10 to 20% of the energy at one trophic level is actually transferred to the next trophic level. And so here's kind of an example. So you might have a producer here. So much of it is not consumed, but some of it might be ingested by the next level up. Of that, some of that energy is wasted in the waste, and then other might be assimilated into the next trophic level. But if we actually put numbers on this, you see that like if we have 1,000 starting here in terms of kilocalories, the amount of trophic efficiency once we get to the respiration and the waste is going to be much less, where we're only left with 14 of the 1,000 left, or 1.4% of the energy transfer as we go up. So again, we need to make sure that we're supporting the species at each level so that we do have enough energy for those higher trophic level species. So when we talk about gross very primary production, again, when we experimentally examine metabolism, we often measure respiration as the oxygen change in the absence of light, and net primary production, which is the production during the day. So the gross primary production takes into account that both photosynthesis and respiration occur at the same time. So if respiration is in the absence of light is soon to be equal to the respiration during light, then the GPP can be calculated as the clear chamber oxygen exchange between the dark chamber oxygen exchange. So gross primary production is going to be your net primary production plus your respiration that takes place. And the reason why this is important is because when we look at especially aquatic ecosystems, for example, we want to understand where the net primary productivity is so that we can understand where we want to kind of how we design the system, like how deep we design it, what types of curvature do we do, how do we create different types of systems for different types of species. And so if we look at depth, for example, you can see that most of the primary productivity actually takes place at a fairly shallow depth, right? And that's because of the light intensity and what can get down to get that primary production. As you go deeper, we have less light intensity, so we have less primary production. So if we look at the global map of primary production, you can see here that we get a lot of our primary production here where we are here in the Northeast. also in the Northwest. Again, in the Amazon, we can see here, and in different parts of the world, you can see these primary production ranges. And if we turn that upside down to the global maps of primary production in the oceans, you can see here that again, right in these areas along these areas of land, we are seeing the primary production being greatest where they have the nutrients that they need, the runoff in the coastal areas. And so we can see here when we look at world net primary production, again, our total acreage of primary production. And we're really getting a lot of our primary production, again, from the savanna, from the tropical rainforest, the cultivated land. But we're also getting it in the marine environments. And we actually, because there is so much more land in the marine environments, the open ocean, we are from algal beds, estuaries, we do get a lot of our primary production there. But we do need to understand kind of where it is. So if we're thinking about something in the marine environment, their standing biomass is going to be very low, but their net primary productivity of a tropical coral reef, for example, is very high. So it has the same net primary productivity as a tropical rainforest, but the difference is it doesn't have a lot of standing biomass. And so all of these are important things when we think about taking into this, again, this idea of ecological engineering. We need to understand the ecology. We need to understand that population ecology, ecosystems, the landscape ecology, primary productivity, evolution. But we also need to understand applied ecology, which is the resource management, doing environmental impact assessments, doing the monitoring, taking in the toxicology, doing the risk assessment. And then we have to think also about ecological economics and how that goes into the system. So we're not just studying the ecology, we understand the ecology, but then we're applying it, providing a framework for that, and then taking into account the economics. But again, when we look at ecological economics, it isn't just the simple cost. How much does it cost to do? It's ecological in the sense that we take into account the other things that illustrate benefits to the environment. So if we look at, again, we talked about H.J. Odom being one of the leaders in the ecological engineering movement. If you look at his book, Energy, Environment, Power, and Society, he kind of hints here at the important features of ecological engineering. So these are the things that were very important. It talks about networks between species, seeding these first species, pulsing, so that you have, again, the idea with the pulse is that it creates this frenzy and you actually have the environment, it gets the energy moving basically more, and it creates a more energy efficiency, energy channeling, microbial diversification. Again, if you're trying to build species, the bottom is the most important so that we can support the top. So we need to have microbial diversification as well as plant diversification. Again, this idea of control species, this idea of natural pay networks, and then energy value decisions. So that's what we're thinking of here. So if we think about conventional engineering, we often use external imposed organization, rigid structures. There's not a lot of adaptation to change. We have a wastewater treatment plant. We're going to keep it. We're going to put a lot of air into there, a lot of pumps. We're going to use a lot of fossil fuels, and we're going to keep it at exactly the same line, right? Because it's predictable and it's safe. And we do that for our drinking water, for our wastewater, for example. But the idea with ecological engineering is that we're going to rely on self-organization of system to solve problems. So it's a new approach, and it basically relies on nature's ability to self-sustain ecosystems. So we don't know exactly what's perfect species to add at exactly what time. The nature ability does that. And so the idea is that we mainly depend on plants, we depend on solar functions, we depend on species to kind of put us in that area and actually keep us sustainable, knowing the sustainability may not be a straight line. It may actually change over time. And so if we look at kind of the field of ecological engineering, you can think of something where it's high sustainability, reliance on self-design, less human engineering, being like a restoration, a prairie restoration, a wetland restoration, mineland restoration. As we start putting in more kind of inputs into it, it might be actually now we're creating systems, creating wastewater wetlands, creating new wetlands, doing agroecology engineering, biomanipulation. And then as we go even further, we have like kind of the solar aquatics, the living machines, and finally the biosphere. We're creating a whole new ecosystem. And so if we think about ecosystems used to solve environmental problems in both terrestrial and aquatic systems, you can think about, in a terrestrial example would be phytoremediation. An aquatic example would be a wastewater and wetland. We're solving a pollution problem. We might imitate or resolve a problem. So we might restore forests or do a replacement wetland. If a wetland's destroyed with Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, we have to actually replace that wetland so that we have no net loss of wetlands. We might recover an ecosystem after disturbance. So this might be a mineland restoration, a lake restoration. We might modify it in a sustainable way. So selective timber harvesting or some sort of biomanipulation of the lake so that we can actually get it to go in the place we want it to. Or we might use it without destroying the ecological balance. So agroecosystems or sustainable multi-species aquaculture. And then again, we want to be thinking about how we can use nutrients to create more food. So if we think about wastewater treatment, for example, after that wastewater, there's nutrients in that waste. And instead of just incinerating those nutrients and having that go into the atmosphere, the idea is we can recycle them back onto land. So really thinking about nutrient cycles and cycling those nutrients back. So thinking at it not only within one ecosystem, but also within a circular economy. Again, imitating or copying waste systems. We talked about this replacement wetland. When we do this, what we do is we first take a reference wetland, a system that hasn't been destroyed, and then we create this replacement wetland to replace what's lost. And we actually compare to the reference wetland and where the original wetland was to see if we have ecological success. And so actually, Dr. Bill Mitch, who has done a lot of work at Ohio State, Olentangy River Wetland Park, here's the Olentangy River. He actually created these two wetlands and he had them in the shape of kidneys on purpose because wetlands are the kidneys of nature, just like they filter out pollutants, just like our kidneys do for our own bodies. And so he had these wetlands here. And what he did was one wetland he actually planted and another wetland he didn't plant at all. And what he wanted to do is look at the criterion for success. And what he found was that the planted marsh, yes, within 5 years, which is the criterion for success for regulatory, did reach that success within 5 years. But the unplanted marsh also reached that success, but it took more like 10 years to reach that time because again, you had to let nature take that time. So either we can plant it and spur it along, or we can leave it unplanted and let nature take it, but it will take longer. And so, but again, we need to think about if we have an undisturbed marsh, here's our wetland that was never destroyed. And then we're actually trying to make a new one. Worst case is, we only have less than 50% cover of what it was before in terms of plant cover. But again, there's kind of this bound of expectation where hopefully we can get close to what it was before. We'll probably never get there, but the average case is still kind of a loss of cover in ecosystem. So what Bill Mitch and Jorgensen did was to try to create these 19 principles to help guide us to how we can create ecosystems that serve, again, human society and the environment. And so I'm going to very quickly go through these 19 principles. So the first one was ecosystem structure and functions are determined by the forcing functions of the system. So when we think about the forcing functions, what's making things, it's about the mass and energy within the system. What is the mass coming in and what is the mass coming out? It's all about mass balance and energy balance. And these ecosystem trajectories are decided by the ecosystem trajectory, where it's going to go is divided by these exchanges and functions, the mass in and the mass out. And so again, if you think about a forcing function, it's anything that enters the system that has an impact on the internal system. So it's in an outside influence that influences behavior and performance. It can be nutrients coming in, the amount of sunlight, the mass, the energy, human input, seeding resources, all of these have this. So if we think about a wetland here, we have the sun coming in, we also have nutrient waters coming in, and then those nutrients then are going to affect our plant structure. They're going to affect the peat that builds up in the wetland and also the water that may run off. And so we actually need to put values and masses on all these. So we know what's the standing biomass, what is the nutrients that's in the system, what's the nutrients that's leaving the system, how much nitrogen, how much phosphorus, how much carbon. So we actually need to quantify all of this so that we can understand and put values on each of these arrows and each of these standing biomass structures. And then when we look at the ecological engineering system, it's not just that. It's not just the reserves and the production and the stresses, but there's lots of environmental sources coming in, and there's lots of goods and services and markets, and the ideas we bring ecological and values, human values and added and values that we get, are we bringing people closer to nature? Is there a value for that? And so all of these, are we reducing greenhouse gases? What's the value for that? And so this is really an ecological engineering system, is more than just mass in but mass out. It's also understanding the greater arena in which it's functioning. Right, number 2. So forcing functions was number 1. Number 2 is energy inputs to the ecosystem and available storage of matter are always limited. So again, the conservation of mass and energy, the first law of thermodynamics. And so the dominant input into ecosystems is solar energy. So anytime we use other source of energies like pump, it may increase the predictability of a system. We know exactly when it's going to come in, but it might reduce our sustainability. 3 is that ecosystems are open and dissipative systems. So again, this is back to the second law of thermodynamics. And again, outside energy might be used for maintenance coming into the system to drive respiration, evapotranspiration. So again, these systems are not closed. We're always having, CO2 come out, oxygen come in, rain come in and out. We have all of these different systems that are affecting it. Ecosystems aren't a bubble, basically. And then we have, again, with the second law, some of this energy comes out with respirated. They're dissipative. We can't use all the energy. Some of the energy is used. Okay, so we got forcing functions. Let's just go over those. Forcing functions, number 1. Number 2 is the energy inputs are limited. Number 3 is that they're open and dissipative. Number 4 is that attention to a limiting number of factors is most strategic in preventing pollution or restoring systems, okay? So the mass flow through ecosystems, and this is to me one of the most important ones, so the mass flow through the ecosystems should be a function of the biological stoichiometry. So what that means is it goes back to the Redfield ratio. We should all know the Redfield ratio, 41:7:1. What is that? Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, okay? So what that means is that we need to do a material flow of the analysis. We need to know what is limited. So the Redfield ratio tells us that if we have if we have more than 7:1 of carbon to phosphorus, if we have, nitrogen to phosphorus, for example, if we have 20 nitrogen to 1 phosphorus, then the plants are going to take up less than there's going to be more nitrogen than they need, because this Redfield ratio is the ratio of carbon, nitrogen to phosphorus that plants need for growth. So you need to figure out what's limiting and what's too much, because what's too much could be your pollution. What's limiting could actually limit your growth of your system. So often the limited nutrient, once we put too much into that, so for example, in inland, P is often limited. So in the Chesapeake Bay, the phosphorus is limited. The lakes, the P is often limited. So what that means is if we provide P for it, we're going to get algal growth. In the coastal systems, again, in Louisiana, it's nitrogen that's often limited in the Gulf of Mexico. And so when we provide nitrogen down the Mississippi River, we get too much algal growth and we get dead zones. So we need to think about what is limiting, and if we're providing too much of that, we may get too much growth. But if we don't provide enough for that and we're trying to restore an ecosystem, we might not get any growth. So we need to really determine what's the most important resource or limiting factor. Is it hydrology? Is it sunlight? Is it rain? Is it the species aren't there? Is it that there's just one dominant species? We don't have enough diversity or resiliency. So you need to, again, pay attention to these limited factors. So again, this Redfield ratio is the homeostasis of the balance between the chemical compositions and the forcing functions. So Redfield actually calculated in 1958 that plankton in the ocean have an average ratio of carbon, nitrogen to phosphorus. It's actually CH2O, ammonia to phosphate. By weight, it's 41:7:1, or by moles, it's 106:16:1. But you can do it either way. So what that means is for every gram of productivity or carbon uptake to actually grow, for this plankton to grow, For every grams of carbon uptake, they need about 17 grams of nitrogen and about 2.4 grams of phosphorus in order to take into their biomass to perform photosynthesis. So if we expect a wetland to take up 10 grams of phosphorus, it's going to have to fix 410 grams of carbon. If this doesn't happen, then some of the phosphorus will be exported out of the system and not uptaken to the plant. But it doesn't account for luxury uptake of nutrients. So sometimes we'll see it that it might have a species that can take up a little bit more than that. So it can be seen as a range, not a fix, but it's a pretty good range that you want to pay attention to. Again, ecosystems have a homeostatic capability. And what that means is that the results kind of smooth out or depressing the effects of strong variable inputs. So we know we have all these inputs and we still kind of maintain the same. We're able to kind of go the same, but that can break out if we just have too much. So we're resilient for a while until we're not. So we should know these ecological buffering capacities and respect them. And so the management can kind of understand what are our capacities, how much can we come in, and what would happen if we exceed those. We also want to match recycling pathways to the rates of ecosystems to reduce the pollution. So for example, if we have manure from agriculture, from dairy manure, for example, we want to put it onto the fields for growing plants, but we want to make sure that when we grow our crops, that we put it on the right rate so that the nitrogen phosphorus that we're applying are the same rate as the nitrogen phosphorus needed for that plant growth, depending on what plant we're growing. Design for pulsing systems whenever possible. Again, the idea is this pulsing paradigm that pulses have greater productivity, biological activity, chemical cycling, and then systems with relatively constant powers. And so we'll think about systems that benefit from pulsing. And one of those is actually kind of this idea of the frenzied consumer and with the locus of and then the descent. So the idea is that we have these locusts that grow and grow and grow, and then they grow so much to where they actually eat up all the crop and the producers go down and then the consumers die and then it kind of goes again. And so this idea that there is this pulsing rhythm to life, and so we need to kind of understand that pulse and design around it or with it. Ecosystems are self-designing systems. So again, the cost of energy for system maintenance decreases if we don't have to put as much energy into maintaining it, if the system has developed into a self-designing system. Again, self-organization is the directional change of species compositions when its surroundings change. So it may be that if things around our ecosystem, we have more nutrients coming in or less nutrients coming in because the landscape has changed, then our species composition will change. And so we need to think about agricultural land, pesticides, and how we can use self-design to kind of treat these systems and provide, and not always try to get it in one direction, knowing that if the inputs change, the species are going to change. We need to think of processes and ecosystems have characteristics of time and space scales that should be accounted for in environmental management. So again, desertification due to drainage of wetlands and deforestation is a space scale. Think about the Sahara Desert, right? That once we start deforesting at some point in time, we need to think about the time and the space for these things to happen. And so if we think about the use of tide to transfer fresh water to the sea as rapidly as possible, example, this principle. So again, using the right time and space scale in ecological engineering, understanding nutrients in and nutrients out, understanding at what point are we hitting tipping points, just understanding that. Number 10 is biodiversity should be championed to maintain an ecosystem self-designing capacity. Again, biodiversity can increase this buffering capacity, this homeostasis ability, and enable it to meet a wide range of disturbances through self-design. Ecotones and transition zones are important for ecosystems, just as membranes are important for cells. So again, this idea of here's a stream and here's some agriculture, but we have these filter strips, we have wetland restoration, we have windbreakers, we have riparian forests, we have grass waterways. The idea is that they can absorb undesirable changes in the ecosystems to protect the ecosystems. For example, the stream system. Coupling systems should be utilized wherever possible. Again, a system cannot be isolated. It must be open because it needs input to maintain these systems. And we should always consider how they're interconnected in the local, regional, and global scales. Number 13 is the components of an ecosystem are interrelated, and form a network, implying that direct or indirect effects of the ecosystem need to be considered. 14 is that it has a history of development. Mature systems should be emulated, but we need to understand the history of development and judging the time that we need to allow before judging the success of the system. Ecosystems and species are most vulnerable at the geographic edge, so you don't necessarily want to plant species that are at the edge of their tolerance of where they're going to grow. You want to plant species that are in the middle of that tolerance zone so that we can increase their buffering capacity. Ecosystems are hierarchical systems, so they're part of the larger landscape. So again, integrated agriculture, aquatic landscapes that have diversity, the right conditions in terms of pH, oxygen, temperature to various organisms fitted within those zones. So we need to think about the larger landscape for when we're thinking about what species and what organisms and the design for our ecological engineering concept that's inside that larger landscape. Physical and biological processes are interactive, so it's important to know both the physical and biological interactions to interpret them properly, the flow, the hydrology, the organisms. And finally, ecotechnology requires a holistic approach that integrates all the interacting parts and processes as far as possible. So the system's more than its parts, so we need to take a holistic view. And then finally, information is stored in the ecosystems is stored in its structures. So we need to know the structures of the ecosystem so that we know the energy that's coming in, we know the organisms that are there, from microbial to plants to consumers. And again, the organism side is going to determine the rate of development, the speed of movement. The microorganisms are going to move at a very different rate. So we need to really understand our systems so that we can understand their structure. All right. Thank you very much.